My lords, your eminence, excellencies, colleagues, friends, comrades, ladies and gentlemen, good morning from this session about the UN Partition Plan, which was issued by the UN General Assembly on the 29th of November 1947. Today, we are having a new platform and in a new slot, I'd note, which is a Sunday morning slot, a slot we haven't tried before. But indeed, we said initially that it will be recorded so that it will be distributed straight after the end of this session. I know it may clash with many either religious or family duties, but still some people are with us, surprisingly enough, and in any case, it will be distributed. Ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted today to be having with us several prominent speakers. Dr. Samir Abed Rabo, a Palestinian-American academician specializing in international law. With us as well, Dr. Emile Badarin, who is a Palestinian, Swedish, British academician specializing in politics. And we are more than delighted to be having with us Professor Dr. Farid Esack from South Africa, a very prominent South African academician, but also one of the most important faces during the last several decades supporting the Palestinian cause. Although as well he is not officially a speaker, but we are positively and glad and surprised to be having with us His Excellency Dr. Muhammad Mahdi Saleh Rawi, the former Iraqi Minister of Economics. He served during the very severe and criminal, I'd say, sanctions and blockade on Iraq. So if Your Excellency, you have any comments to make later, you will be more than welcome. I can see that there are several rooms. I'm delighted that some of them are in the straight room, and therefore we will be starting without further ado. Ladies and gentlemen, again, we are holding this session in order to revisit the text and the importance and ramifications of this very important UN recommendation rather than UN General Assembly decision, which was issued in 1947, exactly 78 years ago and a few hours, or actually without the few hours. And this is indeed was a continuation exactly 30 years after the issuance of the Balfour Letter to the head of the Zionist organization, Lord Rothschild. So we would like, please, to start for around each speaker, around between 12 and 18 minutes. We will see how each one of you will feel. We'll start with Dr. Samir Abed Rabo, then move to Dr. Badarin, and then have a very welcome and international concept and intervention from Professor Farid Esack, and then others, including His Excellency Dr. Rawi. So without further ado, Dr. Samir, you are one of actually the first senior academic board members of the Cambridge Center for Palestine Studies. We welcome you again here, and the floor, the mic and camera are yours, please.
Thank you so much for inviting me again to speak about an important subject. Unfortunately, we are talking about one of the subjects that has impacted our lives as Palestinians and still does. Before I start, I want to flash 4 terms for us to think about. And the terms are colonialism, international consensus, international legitimacy, and decolonization. We all know that 78 years ago, the United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution 181, the so-called Partition Plan for Palestine. In mainstream narratives, 181 is presented as the legal birth certificate of Israel, or the blueprint for a two-state solution. It appears in textbooks as a natural technocratic plan designed to bring peace. But obviously, I'm going to peel away the mythology, and hopefully a different picture will emerge. Resolution 181 was not a peaceful compromise as it was marketed. It was not a legitimate exercise of the United Nations authority, and it was certainly not an act of decolonization. It was a political maneuver shaped by power, imposed without the consent of the indigenous population, the Palestinians, and later used to legitimize the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people that followed. With you today, I want to walk us through 5 key points that will help us understand Resolution 181. The 5 points are the context and objective of Resolution 181. The second point, who drove it and who was excluded. 3, how the vote was manufactured. The vote on Resolution 181 was manufactured. The fourth point is the legal authority of the United Nations itself. And the last point, the consequences, including how 181 was used, distorted, and ultimately abandoned. You don't hear that much about Resolution 181 from the Israeli side anymore, but unfortunately you hear a lot about it from the Palestinian side. Let us begin, and I would begin with the context and the objective. By 1947, the British mandate in Palestine was collapsing under its own contradictions. Britain had promised the land to 2 peoples, one native, the Palestinians, and one recently arrived, the colonialist Zionists, and now faced upon an open revolt rather than end colonization responsibly. Britain simply handed the crisis to the new United Nations. So the United Nations inherited a colonial emergency, yet it treated it as a technical exercise. The resulting committee, the UNSCOP, claimed its goal was to produce a fair and workable solution. But if we look closely, it ignored the Palestinian national rights, even though Palestinians were the overwhelming majority. It framed the conflict as 2 competing nationalisms, Palestinian Arab nationalism and obviously the so-called Jewish nationalism, erasing the basic fact that one side was indigenous and one side was a European settler movement. And it concluded that partition was the only practical solution, not because it was just, but because Zionist settlement had created new facts on the ground. It is not the just solution, but because Zionism or Zionists were able to create settlements on the ground. They were there, therefore we have to treat them as legitimate. In other words, the committee's logic was deeply colonial. Since a European settler project had taken root, the indigenous people must adjust to that colonial reality. Not the other way around, but the indigenous people have to adjust to this new emerging colonial reality and accept it. Their land must be divided to compensate for someone else's immigration or political objective. This was not decolonization, it was the management of colonization. The second point, who drove 181? The idea that 181 reflected the will of the international community is a myth. You cannot describe it any other way. The truth is that partition was engineered by powerful forces. First, the United States exerted enormous pressure. President Truman personally intervened. American diplomats lobbied, threatened, and forced similar states to vote yes. Some countries literally changed their votes under US pressure. Second, the Zionist movement carried out an extraordinarily effective global lobbying campaign, especially in Washington. I here want to recall what Truman said: I do not have 100,000 Arabs to vote for me. So he was subject to tremendous pressure by the Zionist global lobbying efforts to pressure him to go and vote for the partition plan. Third, the UN committee itself was structurally biased. It was made up of 11 states, not a single one Arab or Islamic, not a single one from the region. The committee visited Palestine under Zionist guidance and held only superficial meetings with Palestinians. But even more important is this: the indigenous Palestinian population, the majority of the population, had no seat at the table. They did not participate. They boycotted the committee for a simple reason. The committee's mandate treated them as one party to a dispute rather than as the people of the country. So they were part of two parties to the conflict, not the main party that its land being literally stolen from them. Let us be clear, 2/3 of the population, even if we are to take into consideration the new colonial settlers that immigrated to Palestine, 2/3 of the population was never consulted on the proposal to divide their homeland. So when we look at whom drove 181, Resolution 181, the answer is one, a colonial movement, that is the Zionist movement. Second, a superpower, that is the United Nations, if we are to ignore the the United States, if we are to ignore the United Kingdom. And I personally think the United Kingdom was an active player in this colonial plan to adopt Resolution 181. And a committee, a UN committee with no legitimate representation of the people most affected, the Palestinians. Palestine was partitioned, and let me be clear, by people who had no right to do it, while the people of the land were deliberately shut out, were kept out of the process. The third point out of the 5 points, the vote, a manufactured majority, not self-determination. On November 29, 1947, the resolution passed by 33 votes to 13 votes with 10 abstentions. But the number alone hides the real story. First, a 2/3 majority was required only of votes cast, not of all members. Abstentions lowered this threshold because if you only required those present to vote, then that resolution did not pass. But since you required everybody, the vote of everybody, then yeah, that was a technical maneuvering that allowed the vote to pass. Second, several countries faced extraordinary US pressure, and I name 3 of them: Liberia, Haiti, the Philippines, and many others. All changed their positions after American interventions. They voted no, and then later on came and voted yes. Third, every Arab and Muslim majority countries voted against it. So did India, so did states with strong anti-colonial movements. But the most important point in this, I feel, the people of Palestine, the actual inhabitants, overwhelmingly rejected the partition plan. A vote by foreign governments cannot override a people's right to self-determination. No parliamentary arithmetics or calculations in New York can erase the principle that the land belongs to those who live on it, to its people, the Palestinians. This was not self-determination. This was the internationalization of colonial decision-making that is still with us to this day. The fourth point, legal authority. Did the UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, or its committee had the power to partition a country? Let us address a foundational misunderstanding. UNGA Resolution 181 was not legally binding, as with all UN General Assembly resolutions. The General Assembly does not have the authority to partition a country. It can only make recommendations. Partition of a country required 2 things, basic things in international law. One, the consent of the people, the indigenous people, in this case, the Palestinians. The second point, the agreement of the mandatory power, Britain. Although I think it was already in agreement, Britain already in agreement of the partition, but it insisted that it was neutral. Maybe we should take it for what it is. Neither consent nor agreement existed in this case. Even within the United Nations, legal advisors stated clearly that the General Assembly has no legislative authority to impose border or create states. Under international law, at that time, Palestine, like all non-self-governing territories, had the right to independence as a single territorial unit. By recommending partition without the consent of the indigenous people, the United Nations violated two core legal principles. The first one, self-determination of colonized peoples. And the second one, territorial integrity of occupied territories. On those points, the United Nations failed. So from a legal standpoint, Resolution 181 has the same standing today that it had in 1947. No legal standing, no moral standing. A non-binding recommendation rejected by the majority of the people, it targeted the majority of the Palestinians, to this day, reject the partitioning of Palestine. They rejected it then, and they reject it now. The fifth point, and the last, the consequences. Now we arrive at the most devastating part of the history of Resolution 181. The Zionist leadership accepted 181 only tactically, not because they supported its terms, but because it offered international cover for the establishment of a state through force. Their strategy was clear in internal documents. Take what is offered now, reclaim the rest later. Those are the two principles that guided the Zionists from the beginning. And that is exactly what happened. Months before the mandate ended, armed Zionist militias launched coordinated attacks across historic Palestine. This was the beginning of our Palestinian Nakba, the expulsion of more than 700,000 Palestinians and the destructions of hundreds of villages. By the way, I do disagree with the number of 700,000 because it does not take the actual figure of Palestinians in Palestine at that time, and they thought that the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza were spared. I think it was the entire population of Arab Palestinians was impacted, and that figure was more than 1 million Palestinians. Israel did not confine itself to the 55% given to it by the UN, Resolution 181. It immediately seized more than 78% of the country, which is 23% more than it was allocated to it by Resolution 181. Meanwhile, the Palestinian state envisioned in 181 never came into existence. And the reasons why: its land was conquered by Israel, first. Second, the populations were expelled. And the international community, unfortunately, did nothing to enforce even its own inadequate recommendations or a plan. So 3 points you have to take into consideration when you look at 181, the aftermath of 181. The land was conquered by the Zionists. The Palestinian populations was expelled by the Zionists. The third, the international community itself did nothing to enforce its recommendation. After 1948, the United Nations quietly abandoned 181. By the late 1960s, Resolution 181 had been superseded by new legal frameworks, such as United Nations Security Council 242 and 338. So they made the historic mistake. They abandoned it, and with it, they created the new realities that became the realities that we had to deal with today. No government today claims Israel's borders come from 181. Israel's borders come from war, from aggression, from expansion, not from international law. Yet, in public discourse, Zionist institutions still invoke 181 as international legitimacy. This is hogwash. This is historical revisionism. Israel's borders were obtained by waging war, by force, and by the expulsion of Palestinians. The true legacy of 181 is not legitimacy. 181 did not give Israel's borders of today any legitimacy. It is the legitimization of a settler colonial project through a veneer of international legality. In fact, the veneer is very thin, if it exists, if it ever existed. In conclusion, and I don't want to go above the minutes allowed to me, let me close with 3 lessons that I believe activists and scholars must take from Resolution 181. The first, international law without enforcement enables injustice. 181 was the first of hundreds of UN resolutions that Israel ignored. The pattern was set early. The colonizer acts, the UN expresses concerns, and the people suffer. Law without power is a performance. Law without justice is a decoration. Let us not fool ourselves. International law, sometimes without the power to enforce it, is a gimmick. Second point, partition was not a solution. It was a colonial impulse. The UN carved up a colonized land to appease a settler project, not to protect an indigenous people. And the violence that followed in 1948 and every day since, is rooted in that decision. The third point, a just future must reverse the principles denied in 1947, and that is the right of the people to self-determine their future, and the second point, the right of the people who were expelled to return. In addition to those 2 points, Palestine is a one unit. It cannot be divided, it cannot be partitioned. The rights of the Palestinian people, the indigenous Palestinian people, should be recognized and restored. The end of colonial domination presented by the State of Israel must end. The return, the restitution, and equality for all who live in Palestine must be enshrined and recognized and respected. Resolution 181 failed because it tried to solve a colonial problem without decolonization. It tried to divide a land without consulting its people. It tried to provide legitimacy to a project of dispossession. Today, as we witness ongoing genocide, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing, remembering 181 is not about nostalgia. It is about clarity. We need to be clear with our demands, with our terminology. It is about naming how international institutions fail the oppressed people and why liberation requires collective power, historical truth, and refusal to accept the colonial story. Only by understanding the failure of Resolution 181, a future beyond them, a future of justice, return, and equality in Palestine can be accomplished. Thank you for listening to me.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Samir Abed Rabo, for this fascinating presentation. May I kindly move now to Dr. Emile Badarin to present to us his account, not quite according to perhaps the legal path, because he specializes in politics rather than international law, like Dr. Samir Abed Rabo, but it's hugely important to hear his account. So, Dr. Emile Badarin, the screen and mic are yours, please.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be talking about this important topic. And following from what Dr. Samir Abed Rabo has gave us an excellent and detailed analysis and background of the recommendation, the UN recommendation to partition Palestine. I want just to touch briefly on a few things here, especially about the political meaning and consequences of this resolution. This resolution remains very central to understand the international legitimization of the Zionist project and enterprise to create a settler colony in Palestine, as well as the dispossession of the Palestinians. So the partition plan was not an isolated event. It wasn't just one of these, resolutions in the United Nations, but part of a longer chain of Western colonial endorsements of these colonial enterprises, because it was created by external actors. So that's precisely why the Israeli state, when it emerged in 1948, in its declaration of independence, so-called, explicitly cites these documents and these events and these Western colonial documents and resolutions and decrees, because it gives them evidence to, as it's cited in the Declaration of Independence, to the historic connections between Jews and Palestine, as if anybody actually disputing the connection between Judaism and Palestine. It's quite on the contrary. The Palestinians accept that, and they consider Judaism part of their history anyway, the ancient history. What the Palestinians contest is the right of European settler colonial settlers coming and taking over their homes. Is not about Judaism or Jews' connection to Palestine. So this resolution is part of a chain. One of them is we talked about not long ago, the Balfour Declaration, which was later on embedded in another chain, the League of Nations. In the League of Nations mandate and its resolution in 1922. And later on, against that, it came also against the background of the Palestinian revolt in 1936, which was later on like crushed by the British and basically left the Palestinians defenseless. As a result, the British came and just had a commission. It was called the Peel Commission, which basically and roughly its logic was the same as the partition plan to divide Palestine between into two states. One of them would be a Jewish state, and the other one would be an Arab, basically a Palestinian state. So that's the logic on which the partition plan built on the British basically way of thinking, and that's what precisely the British they have done everywhere they went is the way for them to move forward is just to divide whatever areas they have. What is important about the UN partition plan, resolution 181, is that it gives territorial meaning, territorial definition to that colonial entity. It's one of the first times that an international, although the United Nations was dominated at the time by Western colonial powers, it gave it like tangible territorial legitimization, and also spelled out the idea of having a Jewish state in Palestine. So by 1947, this system, which was dominated by the West at the time, institutionalized and normalized this idea of creating a settler colony in Palestine without the consent of its indigenous people. Actually, all of these documents were designed to override the will of the actual owners of the land, the indigenous Palestinians in Palestine. So this is the trajectory that we are operating against. And this is also what made this plan so important and so pivotal, because it offers territorial recognition to a settler colony, regardless of the percentages. Dr. Samir explained them very well. It accorded the Jewish population in Palestine, which was the minority, basically 56% of Palestine. But also, ultimately, it also endorsed the ethnic cleansing, the principle of ethnic cleansing, of moving the Palestinians basically outside their homes. And that's very important as a background that leading up to Nakba in 1948. For the Zionists, they never had the intention to implement the plan, yet they lobbied hard and tried hard to make it pass through the United Nations. What mattered for them is not really the details of the plan or how much gave the percentages, how much land it gave to whatever the settler entity, how much to the Palestinians. What mattered there is the normative victory, is the idea that they have an international document that confers international legitimacy on this settler colonial project. And that also at the same time sanctions the disposition and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. So that's why they cared and still care about it so much. And the plan itself, it didn't just disappear, it has an afterlife. And it was very important for the recognition of the Israeli state in 1949, in May 1949, by the United Nations and accepting it as a state in the UN. So the United Nations had an ad hoc political committee, which was basically concerned about the original, and still is, the Zionist goal of creating a Jewish-only state, basically this idea of exclusivity and ethnic cleansing, even though it was endorsed. And so made its acceptance in the UN conditional on accepting the UN Partition Plan, Resolution 181, but also the Resolution 194, the right to retain the Palestinians' right to return to their land and repatriation of the Palestinian refugees. What Israel did, it promised the United Nations that it will basically comply with these resolutions, but at the end, of course, they were ignored. And that's the whole point behind all of these documentations and all of these resolutions and UN whatever votes, is just to get whatever possible legitimacy for something totally illegitimate and also built by others, by other colonial powers, especially Britain and the United States later on. And the concerns with this exclusivity and supremacy, they were very clear to the members of the United Nations at the time. For example, the Chinese delegation at the time was very concerned and refused to, actually it abstains when it came to the Resolution 181, because, and I quote here, they didn't accept what's called national homogeneity. They didn't accept this exclusivity, the exclusive proclivity of the Zionist project in Palestine, because it will lead to the dispossession and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians ever since. And the Palestinian position, that's very important for us to keep in mind, because some of the Palestinian leaders these days, especially the current ones, they kind of refuse or try to, they change their mind regarding the Palestinian position on the partition plan. The Palestinians, they were represented by the High Arab Committee. They refused even to participate in the UN Special Committee at the time, which was sent to Palestine to investigate the situation, and then later on came and recommended the partition of Palestine. They refused to participate in that committee because they were right, and they had the foresight back then to understand that even their participation in these committees would lend legitimacy to that project that would transfer the land into a settler colony and dispossess them and make them homeless and basically refugees living in exile. So they refused not only the plan, even to participate in the proceedings in the committee that was sent to Palestine to investigate what was going on. Because they rejected that, because they had, and their position is that Palestine is indivisible. Their position was, we need to have an independent Palestinian state, undivided, with equal rights for everyone who lives there. So it wasn't based on basically exclusivity or purity or whatever. It was a pluralist vision, and that's what we need also to keep in our struggle today. So as we know that the vote was passed with a very narrow margin, and there was lots of lobbying going on and pressure on lots of states, and it was even postponed, I think, 2 or 3 days in order to gain to get that support in the United Nations. But what mattered here is that the Zionist enterprise, where they were learned, it was what happened then, the espionage campaign to force or pressure states to vote in favor of the partition plan became basically a background against which the Zionist entity started to operate ever since, and that's kind of introducing the idea of lobbying at an international stage. They were basically spying on basically every single state in the UN at the time, including the British committee, the British delegation at the UN. So to conclude here, now how many years? We are 78 years since the passing of that resolution. Israel still really cares about it. It commemorates that resolution. For example, they have monuments for it. Some streets are called after the name of the 29th of November 1947. I think they called in Hebrew Kaf Tet B'November. You find lots of streets named like that. So why they care about it, as I said there, because it gives them that kind of external legitimacy, which they deeply, deeply need. They can't operate without it. So it is as I can say this, the partition plan is a culmination of a colonial process that legitimized partition and facilitating the ethnic cleansing and Nakba of the Palestinians, and now the ongoing also ethnic cleansing since Nakba, and as we have seen in the last 2 years, has become genocide. That's basically, if this is the case, this is part of the infrastructure that legitimizes this entity and still care about that. I think that should be a part of our struggle for liberation as Palestinians. We need, as the international system is changing now, the system that gave Israel this legitimacy and support is changing now, and the structure of the United Nations today is completely different than the structure of the UN in 1947. Back then was dominated by basically colonial European or Western states. And part of the struggle we need to ask maybe to show, as Dr. Samir have illustrated and demonstrated, that these are colonial basically decrees. We don't accept them, but we maybe need also to go back to the United Nations and ask for revision, because they are both illegal, illegitimate, and non-moral resolutions. So that's part of the struggle of the Palestinians that they need to work on and restate the original Palestinian position ever since that has been that Palestine is indivisible. Palestine is a place for all, where everyone can have basically equal rights and live their life. So that's showing the illegitimacy of these structures is central to the struggle for liberation in Palestine and for creating a decolonial reality in Palestine. And thank you. I will stop here, and then we will reflect in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Emile Badarin, for this wonderful angle that you have just presented, which in fact takes us neatly to our third distinguished speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted indeed to be having with us a towering South African figure. He's a scholar, an activist, a prominent public intellectual. Professor Dr. Farid Esack is a very well-known face in the South African scene, but I'd say as well in the third world, as well as in Europe and beyond. He holds a PhD in theology from England, the University of Birmingham. But more importantly, the late international hero Nelson Mandela appointed Professor Farid Esack as the Commissioner for Equality and later on as well religious dialogue. And the President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, presented him with the Silver Medal of South Africa. Professor Esack is a very well-known face when it comes to Palestine. Behind him, decades of activism, championing Palestinian rights, as well as this really neatly ties with his activism against apartheid. So without further ado, we would like to, we have been eagerly waiting to hear Professor Farid Esack's take and provide us with this international comparison and input. So, brother, comrade, dear scholar and colleague, Professor Farid, we are really pleased to be having you. The mic and screen are yours. You need you to be unmuted, please. Still, yes.
Thank you very much for this honor and for the invitation to speak, the opportunity to be with you today. You know, one of the things that struck me as I was thinking about this talk here today, it's a thought that came to me very uncomfortably, because I don't take well to conspiracy theories and in this case, more particularly when they are ascribed to the Jews. I have a very strong antipathy towards antipathy towards anti-Semitism. And yet, there were two words that kept on creeping out. As I was developing my thoughts and reading a bit about the partition plan of 47. And this was, and I think Dr. Badarin had also used the one word, it was called stealth. Stealth, it's by cunning and by deceit. And yet these were the two words, stealth, deceit, cunning, the three words, that kept on coming to my mind as I was reading up on it. And this is how through a process of deceitful incrementalism, how the Zionists are willing to, at a public level, articulate what seems to be a doable and in the colonial liberal mind, an acceptable or the lesser of evils option that the world must adopt to deal with at that time the Jewish problem. And this on the one hand, so we articulate this position to make it as palatable as possible to our allies. And this, on the other hand, the knowledge that this is part of a larger project, but we will get to that later. And so some scholars, some Zionist scholars, articulate the larger issue and the larger ambition, that this is what our real plan is for a greater Israel, or that we know it would necessitate the elimination or the expulsion of the Palestinian people. But let's not get there at the moment. Let's foreground the need of the Jewish people for a homeland, or let's foreground, the guilt that results from the Holocaust and so on. Let's foreground that. And then later on, as we increasingly turn or wring the necks of the Palestinian people, we will create more facts on the ground to get where we want to. But at the same time, what they really want and get to, it's only unarticulated at a larger political forum wherein the viewers are also non-Jews. But when it comes to the internal Jewish discourse, then they are quite unashamed about where they want to go. And this is even seen in the current developments inside the Israeli government, where some of the more right-wing, if this can be possible, yes, indeed it is, some of the more right-wing voices inside the Israeli government, they are who outrightly call for the elimination of the Palestinians, the legitimacy of killing, the legitimacy of eliminating, killing children and innocents, the clearly articulated vision to destroy whatever there is left of Gaza for some, and for other, whatever is left of the Palestinians, which of course they already erase in their language by not talking about the Palestinians, but as the Arabs. So these elements, they dismissed publicly as the lunatic fringes of Zionism. But it's really, they are embarrassing for our current public relations policies. That's what the problem with them is. It's not that we want to get there also, but internally they all articulate the idea that we also want to get to the point of the elimination of the Palestinian people. And this was articulated as early by people like, say, even before Ben Gurion, people with the Balfour Declaration. As early as then, they could see the necessity that the implantation of the Jewish people would necessarily have for the existence of an indigenous population. So, so now, so one of the earlier talking points that was employed against the Palestinians is that their rejection of the partition plan is actually the root cause of all the misery and the conflict that followed. This typical argument that had the Palestinians only accepted the partition plan in 1947, they too could have been celebrating their independence now alongside that of Israel. But this is only the logic that is employed. Of course, inside this very logic, it's a classic case of victim blaming, and yet another case of this deploying ahistorical myths in the service of colonialism. Let me just say quickly, as a scholar of religion also, this is particularly pernicious when the ahistorical myth is also attributed to a divine entity. Where this entity that is above human reasoning, above logic, above the law, outside the ambit of reason. I mean, for God's sake, you can't argue with God. And if God had given us this, how can you possibly, what sensible human being, argues against God? Slightly off the point, yesterday I watched a YouTube, this things of Yair Lapid, who's the leader of the Israeli opposition. And he tells a story in there of where he's an Hungarian Jew. He tells a story in there about his father visiting a place, and the local Jewish community, they could not have the required numbers for a minyan. That is, the quorum for which to have a religious service. I think it's 10. And so they only had 9 people. So they approached his father, can you come? So his father said yes. So then Yair asked his father, why did you, an atheist, agree to go to a religious service because your number was needed? So his father said, look, I'm an atheist. I know that. But even the God that I don't believe in is a Jew. So here's this fascinating, just defying absolute logic, that a God that I don't exist in. Anyway, that's just, I was just wanting to refer for a moment to the deep tribalism and the survival of the tribe that allows you have to engage in deceit. Even this non-believing Jew sits there. Right. So to come back to this argument that I wanted to make, the Palestinians should have, but of course it was never the real intention of Zionists that the Palestinians would ever be having an independent existence. It was simply part of a ruse. So, and bear in mind that this was at the time, when it continues, of course, until today, the conflation between Zionism and the Israeli people, as if the Israeli people in 48 were really the Jewish people, because the vast majority of people, as we know, of Jews, as we know, they were completely anti-Semitic. And this was the earliest attempts already to conflate Zionism with Jewish identity. And yet, as I was saying, the alternative discourse, which was inside the Zionist logic, it was a genuine distinction, far from what was portrayed to the world. So the early Zionists were astonishingly honest about the existence of colonialism and about Zionism as an extension of colonialism. Herzl, Jabotinsky, they all employed the same colonial tropes and tactics used by the Europeans to legitimize their own imperialism. So it wasn't just behind at the back of their heads, as I was saying, it was something that they also articulated clearly. They didn't foreground it in tactical political discourse in their lobbying, but this was actually what they were pushing for all the time. So Zionists openly refer to, for example, I mean, Herzl sought the counsel of Cecil John Rhodes, who was the British colonial master in Southern Africa, and asked advice from Rhodes on how to best proceed with the process of colonization. He described Zionism as something colonial. The first Zionist bank was the Jewish Colonial Trust, the entire endeavor was supported by what they founded as the Palestine Jewish Colonization Association, and of course the Jewish Agency Colonization Department. So at the end of the day, you know, and from the inception of political Zionism in the late 1800s already, when it first developed its germs as part of the colonial project, it was this whole idea of, you know, spirit the penniless population across the border. And so the contemporary attempts to retroactively whitewash Zionism, it's now, you know, it's a movement for self-determination. So self-determination as if the self was there and is there. And so this whole import of people, for various reasons, from abroad is now seen as a self-determination, as if they are living in the land at the moment. So it's not surprising that many people tend to think of the UNGA, of the 47 UNGA resolution, as the major factor. But of course, as we know, this is not the first partition scheme to be presented. As early as 1919 already, there was the World Zionist Organization had another plan. And the differences in these plans merely go in, hey, what can we get at the moment? And by stealth, we will get to the rest, you know? So in 1919 already, the World Zionist Organization, their partition plan included all of historical Palestine, parts of Lebanon, Syria, and Transjordan, Egypt, what is currently Saudi, and even Turkey. And at that time, the Jewish population of this proposed state would not have reached more than 2 to 3% of the total population. And so inside contemporary Zionist discourse, again, you have this argument, please don't speak about that now. And this, incidentally, is one of the reasons why originally there was, in the Balfour Declaration, there was this notion of a homeland for the Jewish people. There wasn't a talk about a state of Israel. It was a homeland for the Jewish people. And so for the English colonialism, the guys who were involved in that, for them, it was a way of making this more palatable to sell to the other imperial agencies. But for the Zionists, it was a way of not defining the boundaries of the new state. Because don't tell them now, but later on, we will gradually expand the boundaries of the new state to incorporate all of this. And as we can see how it is unfolding at the moment, this is precisely what is happening. I mean, the wars against, say, Hezbollah, or the wars against Syria, it's not simply a part of that these entities pose political organs, that they represent political threats at the moment. It is part of the Zionists' actual ideas of expansion. And so, if we consider, you know, that the most of this population arrived of the Jewish population arrived between 1924 and 1939, then even then, the majority of those demanding partition of the land in 47, they had been living there merely for about 20 years to make them up at the most. And of course, it's even worse that the UN Partition Plan had given 46% of what was then known as mandatory Palestine to the Jewish population, despite the fact that until 20 years ago, they were a tiny minority of the population. So through this, Palestinians are expected to agree to give away most of their land to a minority of recently arrived settlers. It's a totally absurd suggestion. In the same way that even the contemporary plans that, say, Trump has come up with, it's absolutely absurd. But in their political calculations of the strength of what's happening behind the scenes and their ability to engage in very sophisticated kind of lobbying that we've seen over the decades, they have every reason to hope that the deceit would not easily be detectable. So this kind of very sensible thing, why should a people rubber stamp their own colonization with approval? Why are they seen as like, you're out of your minds to reject this, and this continuous blaming of the Palestinians for rejecting peace plans? And so they argue then that, no, the necessity comes from the historical persecution of the Jews, and it was fresh on the heels of the Holocaust and so on. While all of this is at the expense, of course, of the Palestinians as an historical necessity, but all of this is really part of plans that they had developed, or ideas that they had developed long before the Holocaust. So just, I just want to refer to a few of these statements before I conclude. In speaking to the Zionist executive earlier, Ben-Gurion had already emphasized that the acceptance of partition is a tactical move and temporary. He said that after the formation of a large army, in the wake of the establishment of the state, we will abolish partition and expand to the whole of Palestine. So it's like, we will tell the world one thing, and inside our own circles, we will say another thing. And so this wasn't a one-time occurrence, nor was it only espoused by Ben-Gurion. Lots of internal debates, letters show this over and over again. Ben-Gurion had written, a Jewish state is not the end, but the beginning. And he details, how that settling the rest of Palestine depends on creating an elite army. As a matter of fact, he was quite explicit. I don't regard, and a quote, I don't regard a state in part of Palestine as the final aim of Zionism, but it's a means of that end. And so the final aim of Zionism, it's lots of different kinds of discourses, from the craziest religious religious fundamentalism to the craziest of Zionist fundamentalism about how far this state must expand. So even ignoring the, quite correctly as Dr. Badarin has framed it, the moral question of requiring the natives to formally greenlight their own colonization, this idea that had they agreed to it, they would most likely still not have had an independent state today, because the objectives of Zionism is fundamentally at odds with the idea of a Palestinian state. So it remains, partition today remains as immoral as it was when it was first presented. As a famous South African liberation sociologist says, it's tantamount to sprinkling some perfume over a heap of cow dung in the hope that the smell would disappear, but that the dung would remain there and gets freshened all the time, if you'll pardon the analogy. So any settlement that is achieved without justice and accountability, that of course simply buries the issues in exchange for what they know is a short-lived quiet. And no matter how long it takes for us, I'm talking now about those in solidarity with the Palestinians, the silence and ignored grievances will always resurface. And this is where it bears a striking correlation with the position in South Africa. where we just kind of, where we relentlessly fought against the normalization of oppression. Anyway, so the calculated deceit, is often, I think it's often there, but politicians and fellow colonialist actors, they pretend that no, these nutters, the crazy guys in Netanyahu's cabinet, we will contain them. So this is what they say. And meanwhile, the Zionists on the other hand say, no, these guys are a bit of an embarrassment. They're talking the truth. But the truth should not be emerging now. Later on, once we've completely captured, as if they haven't completely captured already, the quote unquote international community, only then we will make our moves. So I don't quite know what all of what I've just said means, for where do we go from here. And let me finish on this note. The challenge is, how to promote, project, foreground the morality of and the justness of the Palestinian cause. This on the one hand, and on the other hand, contending with the major problem, and this is the successful employment of deceit. Not deceit, really, but the facade of deceit. Because all of their enablers in the West, they know exactly where this deceit is going to lead, but there is this pretense that they are deceiving us. Let me stop there, people, before I ramble on and on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Farid Esack, for this fascinating presentation. Until now, we heard 3 presentations. One was grounded in international law, the other in political science and international relations, and the third, that of Professor Farid Esack, was grounded really in political theology, political discourse, and whatever is between them. Excuse me. With this triangle that has been drawn in front of us of the screen, we have certainly furnished the viewer with 3 different disciplines that actually tie neatly together. At this stage, if I may kindly make 2, although as chair we do not participate in the discussion, but if I may just use this privilege and present 2 observations. First of all, it's impossible not to think about this string between at least the 18th century and what is being currently perpetrated in the Gaza Strip. I mean, the cleanzocide, this combination of genocide and ethnic cleansing. This cleanzocide, it seems, isn't a matter of the last few years, but in a longitudinal research and observation, one cannot find it that difficult to link between things and resolutions and decisions that took place 120, 30, 50 years ago and what have been happening now. This is the first observation. But then there is a little bit of a possibly clarification that I would like to make. First of all, there are a few questions that we received during the presentations. One about the difference between the UN General Security Council, between the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly, and why what is the difference and what happened. I'd like to present what I know, and thinking that you, the 3 eminent speakers, would like to comment on that. As far as I'm aware, from studying this, I know that it was the British Empire who asked the General Assembly to partition Palestine, and it did not ask the Security Council. Now, did the Security Council in 1947 exist? Yes, it did. In fact, the Security Council of the UN had its first meeting, as far as I can tell, it was in January 1946. Three, did the General Assembly and/or the Security Council partition any other country before? No. The issue is that even the partition of India, Pakistan was not taken by the UN, it was actually by the British Parliament. And more than that, did anything happen later similar? Well, even the partition of Korea took place as an agreement between the Soviet Union and the United States. So this leaves us with the fact, apparently, I need your validation, that the UN General Assembly, in that period at least, partitioned only Palestine. And as you all have stated, this partition was only in the form and the shape of recommendation. Now, what happens later when the 194 General Assembly as well resolution about the return of Palestinians to their homeland happened? Well, this as well falls within the framework of a recommendation. So where does all of this leave us today? I'm throwing whatever I said to the panelists, and if I may kindly ask with a specialist in international law, Dr. Samir Abed Rabo, to comment, please.
The United Nations system that was created by the victors of World War II devised a system that has the General Assembly that included all the so-called independent states, supposedly on equal footing, and a Security Council that has 15 members that included the 5 permanent members with the veto power. The General Assembly makes recommendations. When it acts properly, it represents the conscience of mankind, supposedly. All right? But at the beginning, most of the countries were colonized under foreign power control. You had around 50 countries only as independent, including the European countries. They devised within the UN system a system to decolonize colonized countries, which was called the mandate system. These colonized countries were placed under the mandate system. Palestine was supposedly under the mandate system, and the mandatory power was empowered to prepare the people to become independent. It was not empowered to prepare the country to be divided. That's a fact. The mandate system, although it included the Balfour Declaration in the preamble, empowered the British government to prepare the Palestinian people for independence. It did not empower it to partition Palestine into 2 countries. However, I, as a Palestinian and as a student of history, I think the Balfour Declaration, as I stated before, was the beginning of the establishment of Israel, and the United Kingdom did whatever it could to facilitate the the establishment of Israel, bringing the question of Palestine to the General Assembly, as far as I'm concerned, was just one of those colonial orchestration to at least for the history of books that England was neutral in this event, and it was the United Nations General Assembly that did the partitioning. You will be naive, you will be stupid to think or agree with this logic. England knew exactly what it wanted to do. It was in collaboration with the Jewish Agency of Palestine and its Zionists in the United Kingdom. As I said before, and I repeat, is the recommendation by the United Nations General Assembly legitimate? I don't think it was, because the United Nations itself, the whole structure of the United Nations, in the charter itself, there is no provision allowing the United Nations to partition countries without the consent of its people. International law in general does not recognize the partition, doesn't recognize taking away the land of a people and giving it to somebody else. There's no precedent in law to look at or even study, except in the case of Palestine. I personally will say, let us make sure that we start paying attention to the use of our terminology and also to call the facts for what they are. The partition plan is a one of these colonial steps that the colonial powers have enacted in order to allow the establishment of Israel. In fact, if you look at the recognition letter that was signed by Truman, Truman did not recognize the state of Israel or the government of Israel as a de jure, as a legitimate government. He recognized the government of Israel as a de facto, meaning in control of the territory by force. So even then, some of these colonial powers distinguished between the right of Israel to exist as a legitimate right and the right of Israel to exist because it came to being by force. That's what I have to say.
Thank you, Dr. Samir. In fact, this is quite right, because according to the UN Charter, it does not have the power to partition any country. They said that, and it seems that some studies suggest that the approach by the British Empire was made to the General Assembly rather than the UN Security Council, based on the fact that they knew that the Security Council wouldn't be able to take such decision, and as well using the arguments of both Dr. Badarin and Dr. Farid Esack, that in fact they wanted to create this new political discourse and narrative about this normative victory, which is actually what is a normative victory, is just to have this paradigm shift from a discourse that did not exist to a new discourse that bears a moral right and grants it to the Zionist organization to argue that they have got this right. And this de facto and de jure that Dr. Samir you have mentioned, which is a fabulous point, this is exactly, it seems, what we are seeing currently in the cleansocide Gaza Strip. I mean, now even the Gaza, the 365 kilometers, 53% of them currently are under direct Israeli occupation, whereas the whole of Palestine and the Gaza Strip is under full siege and occupation. So this de facto and de jure, it seems that, and now I'm posing the question to Dr. Badarin, it seems that creating facts on the ground works fine with the international law, or not, Dr. Badarin? I think that you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sure. The thing is, with the Zionist project, all of it, it just came too late when basically colonialism started to recede, at least direct colonialism. And that project at the beginning was fashioning itself as a colonial project until 1945, with the creation of the new international system where you have the United Nations, UN Security Council, international law, etc. And at that time also you have the beginning of what was called then the decolonization. After World War II, Europe could no longer colonize. They need to find a different framework, neocolonialism, etc., indirect colonialism. So the concern legally, as Dr. Samir Rabo pointed out, there's basically no grounds for that project legally or morally whatsoever. But there is de facto, they started to create facts on the ground early on. And that's why all of these decisions are very important for the Zionist movement. Because as a settler colonial entity functioning in a post-World War II international system, they needed these, even though they are very thin veneer-like legitimizations, they still need them and fight so hard to keep them until this day and keep other frameworks that keep that framework, hide the basically the absurdity and the illegality and the illegitimacy of that project. And that's why they have been fighting this long campaign to recognize the facts that they have created and creating schemes that legitimizes whatever they achieve, right? And the same thing that we see here in whether in the entirety of Palestine or in parts of Palestine, whether when they build the settlement, they gradually start to push to find whoever can recognize that settlements. For example, in the 2004, they got a George W. Bush Jr. to recognize the legitimacy of certain, what they call them, settlement blocks in the West Bank, or like these colonies, like Maalia, Domim, etc. They want anybody just to give them any form of, endorsement for whatever factual realities they create on the ground. The same thing what happens today in Gaza with the Trump 20-point plan and so on and so forth. So that's what really the main concern here is really to make what is legally in this current international system is illegal, illegitimate, to hide it up and give it whatever possible legitimization. The thing is that system is crumbling down now. And we need, that's part of the Palestinians should be struggle now, how to reverse these thin veneers, thin whatever laws or resolutions, etc., how to reverse that and basically annul them. And that's part of the really difficult struggle for the Palestinians to go through, given the transitional international system, the changing powers in the globally, the emergence of many important countries in the global south, and so on.
Thank you, Dr. Badarin. If I may kindly not only present Professor Farid Esack with the comments by the two previous speakers, but rather if I'd like to ask you as well, Professor Farid, to stand on this international intersectionality and this comparison, if I may, between what you have been observing about Palestine and what you in South Africa had. And if using the 2 points by the previous speakers, how can one, if at all, in terms of structural power and discourse, can shift or turn this discourse which stems from a de facto rather than de jure, and turn it around, because the international legal system doesn't seem to be rescuing the Palestinians.
Well, I mean, in part, it relates to the whole question of the value or not of incrementalism, where you say that we use these instruments, such as the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice. We use these instruments to get us to a point, where at the very least we draw attention to the crimes that is being committed by Zionists. And then, this is our only objective at the moment. It is not really about the liberation of the Palestinian people. And then also you have other examples of this, the recognition of the Palestinian state. It is materially inconsequential to the genocide that is taking place. But yes, it's just another kind of little, however limited weapon that we can use. So this is unfortunately the cold politics that we have to face. And this is particularly, it is enhanced, this challenge is enhanced by the absence of what we in South Africa had when we called it the frontline states. All of our neighboring countries, every single one of them, with one exception, Malawi, they were very supportive of the liberation struggle. Their hearts were with us, of the populations as well as of the governments. They armed our liberation struggle. They gave succor to our people, despite enormous pressures on these countries from primarily the South African regime and its military powers. So the political dynamics, it's very, very different in relation to Palestine at the moment. Palestinians just do not have any of the countries around them that can be relied upon to be their principal allies. So that dynamic is very, very different. South Africa also, I mean, unlike South Africa, the liberation struggle itself and the larger solidarity movement, I think, made far more effective use of the weapons of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, as we are now seeing becoming more and more effective in relation to Palestine and Israel. So the global political dynamics have really changed. And the challenge that we are living in now is that, the past is dying in front of us. I'm talking about now the international geopolitical order. It is dying in front of us. More just recently, we could see, how even the global powers, with the exception of the United Nations, of the United States, we said just ignore, the United States calling upon the G20 to not come to South Africa, or for South Africa to not do this and to not do that. And South Africa is not really a consequential political player in the world. It's not, I mean, financially, it's not a serious player. Politically, it is not a serious player, but South Africa, and through what it does, kind of really astounds the world, So, but it's not just a question of what South Africa does. The reality is that the United States, for various other reasons also, of which Trump is just the more cold manifestation of this, the United States is really losing its global power in the world. And along with it, of course, Israel, it is inevitable, will also go. But the new is yet to be born, and inside this interregnum that we are facing, this is our challenging times. And normally, when in world history, in between these shifting, there's far more chaos, and unfortunately, also far more death. This in betweenness, and this is one of those periods that we are experiencing at the moment. And so while the new is yet to be born, I do see significant signs of this in a positive direction. If you look at the vast increase that there has been in the alienation of Israel in the international community, the real international community, and from those signs to the crumbling of the right inside the USA, there are these positive signs. And the most painful thing in the short term is the Palestinian price that has to be paid for the acceleration of these positive signs. I mean, the awareness of the crimes of Israel and the complicity in the West in it, it has only come about because of the tens and tens of thousands of Palestinian deaths. So it's a very painful price to be paying. And of course, it's easy for us in the international community to talk about the price that has to be paid because it's only the Palestinians who are actually paying the price. I'm not talking about, journalists or other people who get detained by US immigration or by British immigration, the Galloway thing that we had a day or two ago. I'm not talking about that. The real price is being paid in blood. And that is the tragedy of this interregnum that we are going through at the moment. And interregnum, by all signs, do indicate that we are in for a better phase of how human beings deal with others.
Thank you very much, Professor Farid.
I need a minute to,
Yes, please, go ahead.
I think the price that the Palestinians have been paying in blood was prescribed and known to everyone from the beginning. In fact, in his pamphlet, Theodor Herzl, in 1896, without mentioning the Palestinians by name, he said, and he wrote, supposing, for example, we were obliged to clear a country of wild beasts, we should not set about the task in the fashion of Europeans of the 5th century. We should not take the spear and lance and go out singly in pursuit of bears. We would organize a large and active hunting party, drive the animals together, and throw a melanite bomb in their midst. This is the genocidal mentality of Zionism from the get-go, from the beginning. And it is genocidal mentality against the Palestinians from the beginning to the present, through the last 3 years in Gaza. That's a fact that has been ongoing from 1896 to the present. Another thing I want to bring your attention to, Bernard Russell, the British, since we are coming to you from England, wrote on January 31st, just days before he died, for over 20 years, which means today for over 75 years, Israel has expanded by force of arms. After every stage in its expansion, Israel has appealed to reason and has suggested negotiations. This is the traditional role of the imperial power because it wishes to consolidate with the least difficulty what it has already taken by violence. Every new conquest becomes the new basis of the proposed negotiations from strength, which ignores the injustices of the previous aggression. The aggression committed by Israel must be condemned, not only because no state has the right to annex foreign territory, but because every expansion is an experiment to discover how much more aggression the world will tolerate. End of quote. Unfortunately, the world has tolerated Israeli violence, expansion, and genocide against the Palestinians since before its very existence. And that's why I say over and over again, it is very important for activists, for scholars, to come to terms with the fact that Israel is a continuation of a colonial movement, a colonial power that has been dealt with accordingly.
Thank you, Dr. Samir. What springs to mind, perhaps 3 points. First of all, as we all know, there is this ready-made accusation of anti-Semitism. Anyone who might be watching us later from I'd say, to amongst those who do not like freedom of expression and academic freedom, would or might brand the whole discussion here, or even any of the statements that each one of you made, as anti-Semite. This is one. Some may argue that we don't need even to think about them and just continue. But on the other hand, some may say that in fact, whatever is happening in or at the ICJ or ICC is not helping the Palestinians. So the question is, what is it that should be done in order really to have this paradigm shift? And I'd like to start with Dr. Badarin and then move to Professor Esack, because I am in touch, or we are in touch, with many Palestinians, including in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in particular, saying, look, thank you for all of those who are acting in all these arenas, whether in the streets or the courts or petitions or parliaments or academia, etc. But it's not helping us. Dr. Badarin, please.
Thank you. To make the argument on the distinction between Semitism, anti-Semitism, and the criticism of Israel, we need a different session here. It's very hard to make it in a few minutes. Ilan Papeo normally points out, this you need just a couple of hours at least just to explain the difference between the two phenomena. But I will just briefly and quickly go over them. Both of them, like the Zionism and Semitism, they have totally a different history. There's no way that you can conflate them. Their one is a colonial project that began just not long ago in the late 19th century, whereas anti-Semitism is just as old, it's very old, thousands of years, and its roots are mainly in Europe. So there's no correlation between these two phenomena. In fact, Semitism is a European colonial racial marker, was created in I think was by a German scholar at the time. What's his name, if I remember? Ludwig August Schulzer in 1781, at the time was linguistic distinction, and later on began to be ascribed actually to distinguish Jews and actually Muslims from Europeans, from Euro-Christian white Europeans. And in order to designate them as a different groups that you need to take care of like in a negative sense, just to brand them racially, to brand them. So that racial imagination was very important later on to the creation actually of the Western support for Zionism in order to get rid of the Jews, to remove them outside of Europe for both colonial reasons, economic reasons, and also for racist reasons and theological reasons. I don't have time to go through all of that. So as Joseph Massad argues in his book, Semitism itself, the creation of that racial distinction or code itself, is from the beginning is an anti-Semitic act. It was designed in order to make certain groups as problematic, as irredeemable in Europe. That's something that you need to basically cleanse. So that's the phenomena, and that's what its history. It has nothing to do with the current Zionist organization and enterprise in Palestine. Yet it has been used to exploit, basically, and silence people. And there has been a campaign now, at least for quite a while, to make this equivalency between what Zionism is, what Israel's are, and what Semitism and anti-Semitism, to make like a criticism of Israel or being against that colonial project as something anti-Semitic. Both are false historically and even factually, but they have a specific logic. One logic is to make anti-Semitism something that has territorial meaning and linked to the reality, to what Israel is doing in Palestine. So if you criticize that, you automatically would be into that category. But the other important goal of that one is really to make the struggle, the Palestinian struggle for self-determination, for freedom and decolonization in Palestine as illegitimate, to make solidarity with the Palestinians as illegitimate. Because whatever Zionism is for the Palestinians, it is a system of their destruction. So they will always be opposing it. No matter what, they will always be resisting it. So if you consider Zionism as Semitism and therefore anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, so being against that system would be something basically not acceptable, would be something racist, because that's what Semitism and anti-Semitism are. At the end of the day, it's just a racist discrimination against Jews who they are. So that's the real purpose behind this struggle, to make the two anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism as equivalent, make that equation. Moving to the other point you alluded to, that international law is not helping the Palestinians. I mean, I don't have much faith in international law. It's important. I recognize its importance. But at the end of the day, international law itself, if you look at the background of international law, it developed out of a European colonial needs, and it reflects those needs. And most colonized people, or people from non-Europeans, non-whites, can hardly win anything on the basis of international law when that interest goes against the Western or European demands and interests. There's a wonderful book I would recommend to read by Anthony UNGA, where he discusses international law and empire, and explains the motivation why he wrote that book, because he found, I think, that international law, rarely people from the global south can make use of international law. And that's very evident in the case of Palestine. We have so many resolutions in favor, or at least give the Palestinians something. Yet the outcome has always been not implemented and has been inconsequential. And that's the issue with international law, because at the end of the day, international law that we are dealing with is part of the international system that was created after World War II. And that system functions in a certain way where certain states who have the power can interpret what the law is or what can be implemented of that law and not. And in the case of Palestine, that hasn't been very consequential so far. I hope things can be different in the future, but so far it's not, unfortunately.
Thank you, Dr. Badarin. And what you said it can really lead us neatly to an input from Professor Farid Esack. Look, we've got this example of South Africa. Despite this huge oppression and apartheid, and all these ties between the apartheid regime and America and even the Israeli occupation, at the end, South Africa succeeded. Professor Farid, what can you please tell us from your experience in South Africa, which could inform the Palestinian struggle or path? I know the famous books by Mandela and even long way to justice or to freedom, and another one by Winnie Mandela, similar. But really, it's so important to enrich the discussion by learning from you something scholarly rather than biographical, please.
It is, I mean, let me be honest with you and say that whenever I hear the word apartheid used in relation to Zionism and the genocide of the Palestinian people, I cringe. I feel extremely awkward and embarrassed, because there was nothing in the ideas behind apartheid, in the ideology of apartheid, nor the practice of apartheid that comes remotely close to the ideology of Zionism and the implementation of Zionism. More than 30 years ago already, South Africans who had gone to visit Palestine, Israel, more than 30 years ago, every single South African who was knowledgeable about the struggle against apartheid or had participated in it, they came back saying that South Africa was a Sunday school picnic in relation to what the Palestinians are experiencing. And so my cringing or my embarrassment comes from the shame that these people who are, and this was pre the formal genocide that had started 2 years ago. This comes long before that under quote unquote normal Zionism. And at the same time, I understand, I'm not going to condemn the Palestinians or other people who use the apartheid analogy or the apartheid word in relation to the suffering of the Palestinian people. So that's the first thing that I want to say about the apartheid, the use of the word apartheid in relation to
Professor,
what. Yes.
The idea here was, obviously, what you have just said is very clear, but the idea was not a comparison between the apartheid in South Africa and the Israeli occupation. No, the question was about what the Palestinians can learn with regards to the methods of struggle to create a paradigm shift.
Yes, okay, thanks for that. Well, in that respect, there are lots of things to learn from our struggle in against the apartheid state. And look, some of these methods are being used. And they are being used fairly effectively, although they are taking long. But it was also this idea of incrementalism. We did use international structures. We did push for General Assembly resolutions, and we had very many of them in support of South Africa, the most important of which was the declaration of apartheid as a crime against humanity. And so, with these international instruments, weapons, they were weapons that we could use in our struggle for international legitimation by ordinary populations of those countries. And so, for example, we succeeded in the same way that the Palestinians are also getting there. We succeeded in getting the populations of the various countries, particularly in the global north, onto our side, as is happening inside Palestine. So that was an effective tool. But the most difficult challenge, I think, that South Africa offers to the Palestinian people, and it's like a very, very difficult one, and this is the organization of a liberation struggle that's not that's not engaging in an internal wars to death among themselves. And this has been one of the huge challenges that the Palestinians have been facing. The South Africans succeeded largely in working inside the African National Congress and mobilizing behind it as this broad church that it could present to the world as we are the spokespeople for the South African people. And South Africa has been trying, incidentally, a lot behind the scenes to negotiate the different tendencies and factions inside Palestine. Now, one is not saying that freedom is something that can only be given to people who are well behaving and who aren't fighting. You know, it's like lollipops or sweets that you dish out to children who stop fighting among themselves. We recognize that freedom is not something like that. But this was the one major thing that's different, other than the earlier one that I had referred to. This is the one biggest challenge, I think, that the Palestinians can learn from South Africa. How do you work in a way that doesn't present your internecine battles or your factional battles as the big excuse for why you can now be ignored or dismissed by the global partners? Unfortunately, this bit of advice is far easier said than done. But this, from a South African perspective, it is the biggest challenge that the Palestinians face and that they can learn from us.
Thank you. I think that this needs truly a separate long session to discuss, let alone that the point that you have mentioned, that South Africa, or the struggle for liberation in South Africa, won at the time the support of most neighboring countries, whereas in the case of Palestine, it's slightly different. We see some Arab regimes practically fostering better relations with the Israeli occupation during the cleansercide in Gaza. But this is another story. But this just to point out the support of the neighboring country. May I kindly, and we have now literally 5 minutes so that we reach the 2 hours, because I know that we can go for a long time, but we decided to restrict it for 2 hours. May I kindly ask each one of you to conclude in a minute, what do you think about what should happen with the 181 UN General Assembly resolution, or what's its position now? I mean, what its position now, what its definition now, what its impact now, and what should happen with it. Dr. Samir, please.
In answering your question, I want to say the following. I think I agree with the Professor Esack that we Palestinians can benefit from the international system if we use it right. And I also agree with him that we Palestinians should look at the example of our big brother in the good sense, of our big brother in South Africa, and learn from them that our vision, our organization, our policies, our actions should be very clearly clarified, unified. You and I started this session talking on the side about political shops. We Palestinians have to clean our own house. We have to verify and clarify our objectives and mission, because in clarifying, unifying our objectives, we also can help the international solidarity movement become stronger. The mere fact that we are disorganized, we are not benefiting our struggle, we are not getting to the level of the sacrifices of our people, especially in the last 3 years. I think we are failing them. We are failing our people. I think we are failing our overall struggle. 181, even the Zionists don't cling to it anymore, because the Zionists recognize and they know that force creates facts. Force has been used very effectively by them for their own benefits, and they will continue to use it. So we Palestinians have to learn that international law is something, it is not a cake that is presented to you on a silver platter. International law has to be, anyway.
Yeah, Monday.
Hello.
Anyway, international law has to be properly used by the Palestinians. And I think we ought to stop shooting from the hip and have a solid strategy as to how to go from after the genocide still going on, unfortunately. But we have to come back to the drawing board and make sure that we have a solid strategy to present to the world from now on. That's what I have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samir. Abed. Rabo, Dr. Emile Badarin, please.
Thank you. I think there's a lot is needed here, a lot of work on the Palestinians, of course, and that's what they've always been doing. They're struggling against kind of a global settler colonial entity, and that's part of the differences and what makes this conflict and this struggle very different from others and more complex. More complex than, for example, what the case of South Africa, more complex than Algeria and elsewhere, because of this global element to it, because it's attached to all of these institutions, international institutions such as the United Nations and all the decrees and the laws that and recommendations that they have created since then. And the struggle, part of the struggle, at least external struggle, should be also focused on repealing the entire international structure that has normalized and legitimized settler colonialism in Palestine and the dispossession of its people and the elimination of the Palestinians since decades long. And there should part of that struggle, I think, should be a focus on repudiating the UN Partition Plan or Resolution 181, because it's still important to the functioning of Zionism and Israel. They take what they want from it, and they just, of course, dispose the rest that is not useful. They take the idea that that resolution is coming from an international institution, regardless who was there, regardless how it was passed. They take the idea that it gives it legitimizes and sanctions the idea of creating a Jewish state, and that's very important because there can't be a Jewish state without the dispossession and ethnic cleansing and elimination of the Palestinians. And the second idea, it gives it a factual territorial grounding in Palestine.
Thank you, Dr. Badarin. Professor Esack, please.
First of all, folks, it's always extremely difficult for me or for South Africans to be offering any kind of advice to the Palestinian people. One of the implications of solidarity means that you are led by the people that you are in solidarity with. You don't pontificate to them. You don't focus on their inadequacies. You focus on the enemy, and you focus on weakening the enemy and strengthening your resistance. So this is one of the challenges that I always have. But frankly speaking, one of the challenges I think that the Palestinians have, even in addressing. So fine, we are saying, that all of these legal instruments that there are, that in the long term, in the long run, they have to be eliminated. They have to be replaced by more consultative, more genuinely democratically. If you look at the international demographics and so on. Yes, we do agree with that. And I think we're also in agreement that they have some use, some short-term use in advancing our larger freedom and democracy agenda. That we are all agreed on. And at the same time, we continuously need to think, what can we do from our side to weaken our enemy or to strengthen our cause? And one of the huge things that I think is missing in Palestinian discourse is the articulation of a vision for this new society. In South Africa, it was reduced even to slogans, but we were clear that our struggle was for a non-racial and an undivided South Africa. And later on, it was undivided, it was non-racial and non-sexist South Africa. So we had a clear articulation of a pluralist society that was the answer to the division, the racial division of an apartheid society. Painfully, you don't have such a clear vision emerging from the Palestinian side. There is this bifurcation between the unarticulated, or less articulated at the moment, Islamist vision of the country. And then, so there is that. And we have to, in some ways, be quiet about that at the moment, because Hamas is being reduced to only that, these crazy Muslim characters. But it is problematic for many, many people in the world that we don't find a clear vision of what the Palestinians and their liberation formations, of what kind of society they are wanting for the future. And that will help greatly in making the Palestinian cause I'm sorry for this ugly word, a more marketable cause. But we do need to find ways of strengthening or of supporting also people who are in solidarity with us. And this, I think, is one of the things that I feel awkward about. But again, who am I to tell the Palestinians what they should be doing? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Farid. First of all, I think as scholars, we learn from all case studies, from all types of struggles, be it legal or discursive or otherwise. So we very much appreciate your contribution. I know that Dr. Samir Abed Rabo did not mean to say big brother in the Orwellian manner, rather the older brother, South Africa.
Said in the good manner.
Yes, of course, of course. It's been truly fascinating to be listening to the three of you. And may I kindly just remind you that recently, actually, we've held a conference about Palestine and international law. We held another huge session about Palestinian theology, though the first international conference about Palestinian theology is yet to come. We held another session at the Department of Politics at the University of Cambridge with the African Center, where we hosted one important South African official or former official, Dr. Barry Gilder, who was an ambassador to Syria and Lebanon, but as well as deputy head of security services in South Africa after the apartheid. And we held with as well Dr. Samir and Dr. Badarin a session about the Balfour Declaration and many other sessions that we held. Most of them were face-to-face, and some of them were hybrid, and some only via Zoom. But we have got in the pipe now several other sessions. You will all be receiving notifications about them. But I think that for this session, which has discussed the 181 UN resolution, I think we had quite a rich contribution from everybody, which will somehow inform future discussion and future sessions. So, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Cambridge Center for Palestine Studies, as well as Palestine House and all our team, we would like to thank the speakers, Dr. Samir Abed Rabo, Professor Farid Esack, Dr. Emile Badarin, for their amazing contribution this session, and we hope to see you again soon. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, and please be in touch with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.